Woodworking machinery can cause serious injury. Always read and understand the user manuals for all equipment used. Remember, dust, fumes, liquid, sharp or heavy moving objects can be deadly. Always wear appropriate personal protective equipment or PPE. Any omission of PPE during this presentation is to aid communication and is not an endorsement of the practice. The Nova Woodturners Guild, or NWG, its authors, presenters, and producers assume no responsibility or liability for accidents or damages resulting from the information conveyed within this presentation. Only you can keep yourself safe. Please do. If you're unsure, don't do it.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. We were kicking around for ideas back in the late summer for presentations for meetings. One of the things that I suggested we could do is have a look at some of the things that I've been doing for a while now and using different decorative techniques to enhance turnings that I've been working on. I began playing around with that, I guess inspired by the fact that my wife is an artist, and so I kept seeing her doing creative things, turning a blank piece of board, an old barrel stave, or a piece of canvas into something really quite intriguing. And I thought, well, sometimes we wind up with a turning and it's a pretty plain looking piece of wood when we're done. So that it looked good when it was rough. By the time we get it turned and sanded, it's like, it's just wood. So what can we do with it? So I began playing around with a variety of different decorative techniques. I use acrylic paints, pyrography, metal leaf, and a few other techniques. So what I wanted to do today was just run through various techniques that I've been using and have a look at different things that you can use to dress up turnings, to add a little bit of flair and accent point. And there are many, many other ways to enhance and decorate turnings that you have doubtless seen here at meetings or have seen online. I know, for example, Diane does a number of turnings with colored epoxy set into sort of cutting blocks apart and filling it back in with epoxy. You've seen lots of people. Gary talked about it last month, the combination wood and resin blanks, and so you get a quite decorative pen turning. But really I'm talking about once you've done your turning and you've got something that you might be happy with the form and with the turning that you did, the sanding, but it needs something. It needs something to pick it up and give it a bit of a punch and pizzazz. So I've got a few examples here that I'll pass around that you can look at, and I'll explain what each of these are as we go along. I'm going to try and give Bob an aiming point where I'm going to do most of my work so that he can keep things center stage, and I'm going to use this piece of paper here at the front as the main working stage. I had another piece of paper. So then I'll try and keep the turnings there when I'm working on them, and Bob can aim at that spot. So probably the simplest, this is actually one of the things I like. You can do various techniques using acrylic paints and other pigments or metal leaf and things like that. But you can also get some really neat effects when you start to combine different techniques and put them together. And so this is an example of one. This is just a shallow platter, somewhat dusty, in Peo Amarello or Yellow Heart. It was turned off center, so the rim is in a different position than the main part of the bowl itself. It's acrylic paints that's on the rim, and gold leaf around the edge of the rim, just to do that. And I'll pass it around, you can have a look at it. One of the characteristics of using metal leaf is it tends to crack and break as you're applying it, and so you get that worn antique look that you don't get with, say, acrylic paints or some of the other techniques. If you're just applying acrylics, paints, things like that, there's a whole variety of ways to put those on. And so I called that one Winter Moon, and because it looked like a big yellow full moon in the night sky. That was the kind of effect I was going for. The stars are put on with an old toothbrush. basically by just sort of dipping the ends of the bristles in some paint and then just stroking the bristles with your thumb so that they snap over, and when they snap back, they fling the paint off, and you get lots of random little tiny dots on there. And for the actual constellations, I wanted to make more prominent stars, and so I just took the end of a toothpick and dipped it in the paint and just put them on where I wanted them.
How permanent is the metal leaf?
It's pretty good. It won't stand up to a lot of handling. Tended to get used traditionally on picture frames and things like that weren't going to see a whole lot of handling. But you can extend its life with a lacquer coating or something like that that's going to give it some protection. If it's anything that's going to be handled, like a bowl or a platter, it definitely needs some protection, and because it will wear off. But it wearing off is part of that sort of aged, patina, careworn look that things get. My family's mostly in Ontario, and my wife and I used to visit fairly regularly, and we'd go for walks in woods. And there was one area called the Purple Woods Conservation Area, and that inspired this platter, because it's basically an old managed forest stand, and a local scout group had gone through and identified a bunch of the trees and made little carved signs that they put on the trees that had an outline of the leaf of the tree and a representation of the surface of the bark, so that you could recognize different trees even in the winter when the leaves were off of them. And I was quite intrigued with this idea how they were carving these little signs with the texture of the bark. And so I had this chunk of Purple Heart, and I thought Purple Heart was a great material for something inspired by the Purple Woods. And so I just made some random tree trunk shapes on here and gave each of them different textures in the bark using pyrography, the way I'd seen on the signs throughout the woods. And this is actually colored with gilder's paste or gilder's wax that's often used on signs when you see the signs with the gold lettering on them. And that's what that's done with. It's very easy to apply. It's easy to over apply because it's a sticky wax, and it does tend to get everywhere. As creative and artistic as you want to get, you can get quite elaborate. This is another shallow bowl in butternut, and this was the first collaboration artistically that I worked on, and so my wife did the art on it, I did the turning, and so she did the drawing of the poppy with pyrography pen, and then it's colored with alcohol inks, which can tend to give you really bold, intense colors. But a little more tricky to work with because they are very fluid compared to acrylic paints. So you can have a look at that. Some of my favorite pigments are in the group that's used on this platter, and these are called interference pigments. And they're usually in just an acrylic medium, so it acts like a typical acrylic paint. What they are is pigments that are made from little tiny fragments, microscopic fragments of mica, the mineral that breaks apart into little thin layers, like little layers of glass. Those, once they're ground down to microscopic size, are coated with specific materials. And what that does is it causes the light of a particular frequency or wavelength to be reflected from those particles. So what happens is, typical white light hits the pigment, it passes through the mica flakes, and all the light will pass through except the light that's being reflected by the coating on it. And the color of the light being reflected varies depending on the material that's put on it. And so the end result is, because it's very much dependent on the angles of light and the color of light that's hitting it, it changes as you move things around. So if you walk past this platter, if you handle it and move it, the colors that you see change. You've seen these paints in use. They're quite popular in the luxury automobile industry, and you'll see cars that are done with interference pigments, and they change color as you move, as they drive by. So you see it coming and it's orange, and as it goes by it changes to green as it goes by. And that's interference pigments, because the angle that you're seeing those mica flakes at is changing. And so just send that around so you can have a look at it. And so there are lots of ways to apply acrylic paints. Typical, your typical paintbrush is probably the most common. And if you want to start playing around with these, you don't need to go and get the best acrylic paints you can. Dollar store craft paints work fairly well for a lot of this. For example, this is one I'm going to be using. This is from Michael's. Relatively cheap. It's just a craft paint, metallic paint. Myself, I really like the metallic and iridescent paints, and so I tend to use those a lot. If you're working with acrylic paints, another advantage is it's typically soap and water cleanup. If you need to thin the paints, you can use water. You can also use an acrylic medium. This is a fairly common, relatively inexpensive one. Using medium to dilute the paints, because they can be, they come in liquid, almost like water-like consistency, or a fluid consistency, about the consistency of probably mustard or ketchup, and then in the typical tubes that you get, it's more like toothpaste. It's a thick, gooey paste. Depending on what you want to use them for, is how much you'll dilute them or thin them down. And also, I don't want you to get the idea that this can only be done on bowls and platters and things like this. This is a little box. It was one of our turning challenges a few years ago that I, during the turning of it, created what some folks like to call a design opportunity when I blew through the lid. And so it was destined for the fire pit. But my wife decided that she didn't want to see it go in the fire, and so she took it away and got the pyrography kit out and some paints and decorated it. So you can certainly do that. I've yet to turn a plug to go in the end of that. And so that also is done with the alcohol inks that give the nice intense colors. And so one of the things that we can do, and here's an example of the kind of wood that I will think about for decorating. And so this is a piece of beech, and generally a nice sort of golden colored wood. But this particular piece was just at the beginnings of starting to spalt, and so it's starting to get some of that staining from the fungus that was going to create the spalting lines in it, which doesn't look bad on the curved surface on the outside, but on the surface, the top, on the rim of the it's just these odd gray streaks that are just, to me, going to be distracting and not that pleasant to look at. So this is the kind of piece of wood that I would immediately say, well, I think I'm going to do something with a decorated rim on that piece. And I'm going to have to ask Gary to keep an eye on the time on it, because I keep looking at that and thinking,
Oh, yes.
well, we've got to like 4 o'clock, so I've got like 6 hours to go.
It was in 25 to 3.
Yeah, I don't think that's had a battery in it since COVID, so.
Yeah, no, it's right twice a day.
Yeah. And so,
There's enough power to flip the second hand.
yeah, and so so one of the things that we can do, we'll just get started here, and
Do you paint it and then cut the bowl apart?
yeah, that's typically my process. Is I will sort of decide on the overall shape that I want, turn the outside of that, and this has been sanded and then polished with Ford's Nova Silk. And the surface that you're going to be decorating, you don't want to really sand it to a really fine grit, because you need to leave some, what the artists like to call tooth, for the paint to actually grip. Like if you go to 400 or 600 grit, you'll have a tricky time getting the paint to stick on there. It'll stick there and it'll dry, and then you go to pick it up and it'll smear off and things like that. So I typically will sand to 240, maybe 320, depending on the wood, if I'm going to paint it, and that gives a nice toothy surface on the wood that the paint can really grip onto. And so one of the easiest ways to apply the paint is just simply with a brush. We can do that, and so I'm going to use a lot of different things here, so I'm just going to glove up, as they say. And so one of the things I find is I use a lot of these little cups. These are typically just the little cups that
Ornaments coming.
yeah, condiments. You get some potato wedges or something. They ask you what sauce you want that in. You get a little cup with a snap-on lid. I get rid of the lids and keep the cups. These are little applesauce containers. So any little containers like that, I tend to keep. And so, so this is a typical fluid acrylic. By fluid, they mean sort of. It's not a paste, but it's not really runny. And so I'm just going to add some of the. It's a bit thick for what I want, so I'm just going to add a similar amount of medium, which just looks like milk, and it will make the paint look a bit lighter in color than it will be when it finally dries. So this is a nice sort of intense green. And then you can just simply start to get the paint on there. And I don't worry too much if a little paint goes over the edge, because I'm going to clean up the edges by putting this back on the lathe once all the decorating's done. And I'm going to, as Diane says, my process is basically to turn the outside, sand the surface that I want to decorate, and then put it back on the lathe, and I'm going to turn the inside out, the hollow of the bowl out on the inside. So I'm not being too careful about getting this all perfect and smooth, because I'm going to cover a lot of this paint up with other pigments, but I want to get this on early, so that it can dry before the other pigments go on.
So Calum, is that a metallic paint or is that a flat surface paint?
It's flat surface. It's not metallic. It's just the color itself is phthalo green, PHTHALO green, and it's the blue form of phthalo green. Also a yellow form. The thing with, if you're using the interference pigments, if they're on top of a light colored background, the light, all the colors of light go through them. If you think of the old sort of science class and you had a prism and it broke up light into different wavelengths, different colors, all the wavelengths go through the mica. And if they hit a light colored background, they're all going to bounce off. And the end result is that you see all the light coming back, being reflected off the surface that went through the mica. And so you don't see any effect if it's on a light colored background. And so if you put interference pigments on white, for example, you just don't see them. Or if you look very carefully, you might see a hint of it. If they're on a dark background, then the light goes through the mica and reflects, say, if it's, for example, a red interference pigment, it'll reflect the red light, so you'll see the red light. All the other colors of light going through the mica get absorbed by the black background, so they don't come back. So all you see is the red. So that's just a relatively poor job of coloring on that surface, but we'll just put that aside to dry for a bit.
Stay within the lines.
Yeah. And you can see where it has run over onto the edge a bit, which is another advantage of doing finishing the outside with the Nova Silk. It leaves a wax coating on the outside, or you can shellac them, and they will, the paints will come off easily. But I'm going to put it back on the lathe, and I can resand anything that's leaked over. So, somebody had a question? Yeah.
How many coats are you putting on that before you throw it back on the lathe?
Normally I would probably do at least 2, just to make a nice even background, but for today I'm not going to bother with that. I'm just going to do that. So what I'm going to do next is show you some of the interference pigments. Again, they look very similar. They're just sort of a gooey liquid. And if you, 2 things I always have handy is a box of Kleenex for minor issues, and a big roll of paper towels for major issues. And so again, I'm just going to use some of the medium in here.
And you say you can use water?
Hmm?
You can use water?
You can use water, yeah. In fact, I've got a little tub of water here, so that if things aren't as runny as I would like to see them, so I will just...
What's the advantage of the medium then?
The medium gives you better flowing characteristics, and there's a variety of different media that are available. It will also give you a bit more transparency in the color, if that's what you're looking for. So I'm just going to add a little water to make this nice and runny.
More than water?
Yeah.
I'm just saying the advantage of medium over water.
Yes. You can dilute them with water, and they work for most purposes really well. So I don't know that the camera will pick this up, but it looks like milk, and that's kind of the consistency I'm aiming for, is just, you know, milk. If you're used to working with epoxies and resins, especially as adhesives, you know, they talk about, you know, for a filler, mix it up to peanut butter consistency or applesauce consistency. Most of the paints I'm working with, it's typically around whole milk or maybe coffee cream consistency. Probably not a whole lot more than that. And so you really don't need a whole lot of paint. One of the things that you'll notice when you go to buy some paints that they vary from color to color in the cost, which is a reflection of the compounds that are used to make the specific colors, and they also you know, are going to vary depending on the brand and the size of paint that you're buying. So I have a pre-made bowl surface here that I'm just going to put the interference paints on so you can see the effect. I just spray painted it with some typical garage spray paint, so I've got black and white on here. And the thing is what to apply it with. Well, I could put it on with a brush. With the interference pigments, if you put them on fairly thick, when they dry, they will dry opaque and white, and you won't see much effect. If you put them on very thin, then all of the medium is completely dry, becomes transparent, and all you're seeing is those mica pigments. And you can play around with that.
Norm was asking if you could address where you get the interference paints at, like, how do you source them?
Yep. You can get them online. It's probably one of the cheaper places, but not necessarily. Desserts here in Halifax, Michael's have some. You'll find a few of the interference colors in the golden line at Michael's. Any sort of decent art store will probably have at least some. And so that's the typical one. So you can use a brush and a piece of foam. One of the nice things you can do with a typical foam brush like this is if you just want to cut it up and you know, cut shapes into it, make marks to give you sort of a random stamping pattern. Something I've used a fair bit is typical natural sea sponge, which again gives you a nice sponge surface. It's very random, and you can get that in stores that like Sherwin-Williams or Dulux or other paint stores. Probably even the building supply places as well, because it gets used for those faux marble effects that people do on walls, are often done with sea sponge. But you can actually get quite inventive and creative. I'm going to move around here. If you want something fairly random in terms of an applicator, you can use crumpled up paper, but that will absorb a fair bit of your paint into the paper itself. You can just simply take some saran wrap and use that as an applicator, and I'll just start putting that on here. You can see as soon as it hits, the color starts to appear, and the thinner I get it, the more red we're seeing. And I'll put a bunch over here on the white, and I'll just use my Jiffy Quick Dry tool. Time is of the essence here.
Low fuse.
We got a lot plugged in here now. Fortunately, we're not using too much of it all at once. So,
Meanwhile,
and so you'll see as this dries, the color intensifies. And one interesting technique that people will use that creates an effect that's been nicknamed cosmic clouds is they will put just a little drop of interference paint on a surface, and then use an airbrush or your air hose off a compressor just to blow it around, or even just a straw and blowing with your mouth to move it around in random shapes. And so you can see as this dries, it's on there, totally enough. Have to keep it off of people's clothes. So I'll just pass that around, and you can see how well it shows up on the black. And it's, if you look carefully, it's on the white, but you really have to look for it. And so it's just the same thing. And so you can get some interesting effects
this angle,
combining
red really shows up.
a few different colors. You can also see that where it's on there a little thicker, there's sort of little dots and points where it was a bit thicker, it has stayed whitish, and so you may want to get really thin. And even though you're putting pigments on thin, you can always put on several layers, just simply as if you're painting a fence. You put the first one on, you can still see all the knots and things like that. So another coat on.
High school again.
Yogi,
Yeah.
just hold that up with the camera.
High school art class.
Give it a tilt.
Are you,
Doesn't show up,
are you putting on a base when you're using
Shows up
that
blue there,
interference,
but it's
are you
red.
putting
Side by
on a black
turn it this way.
base or a dark colored base
No, it doesn't.
first, and then
Yes.
applying that?
Just
Yeah,
try
so that was just
rotating it
black
that
spray
way.
paint on that, and that is why I use the dark
No, it
color
doesn't
as
show up
green
the-
on
No, it
here.
shows
So I'm
blue.
gonna,
I think the
put
color,
that. And
It's more
the bowl that I
purplish.
passed around, I put dark
the
blue
colors
on
are off
first.
the camera.
And you can decide what colors you want to put on that.
Because
The
Caleb's
typical
shirt is
interference
blue.
colors are red, blue, violet, green, yellow.
Is there color balance on this camera?
There's not a whole lot.
Maybe, but
You see his,
Did you use it
his shirt
just on
color
bare
to,
wood, like on a dark
Yeah.
colored wood?
Yes, you could. In fact, if you have a wood like Zebrano or Boccati, something like that, that's got really contrasting grain, you can get some wild effects. Because you don't see it as well on the light colored summer wood, and you see it really well on the dark colored winter grain. And so you can get some really neat effects with those really contrasty woods. Just because it's any dark background, it will show up much better than a light colored background.
so Calum, what did that particular container of of interference powder say? Like, does it say you're gonna get a red effect?
Yes, so this is, that one's actually interference violet.
Violet, okay.
Yeah, it was
Yeah,
violet.
yeah,
And golden on their labels, they put this little hash mark of black stripes, and there's, when it goes through the factory,
Yeah.
I don't know if there's a little person with a very tiny finger just puts a little smear, or if there's a machine does that, puts a little smear of the paint. So it lets you see how it's going to look over a white and a black background. In fact, I'll
I put
pass
it
that
on
around so
to-
you can have a look at
I
it.
put it
So
on
Calum,
to
there's some
light.
lines radiating out
I
from the
changed
center.
the light
Yeah,
source.
ignore those. I'm going to come to those.
Sorry?
That was from a test. I'm going to come to those.
Oh, okay.
It's more natural colors now.
see, it's a fluorescent.
The
light,
line
right?
makes it
Fluorescence.
Just get some more things ready. And you can combine colors, and because the interference pigments themselves are kind of transparent, so if you put green over violet, for example, you'll still see both colors. It doesn't become kind of a weird brown color. You see green and violet shining through, because the light's going through and it's hitting the violet particles and being reflected off. It's also hitting the green particles, and those wavelengths are being reflected off. So that was actually a nice segue. It's time to go to the lathe.
So when you do all your decoration, you gotta let it dry for a while. Do you buff it after? Can you buff it?
You can buff it, like once it's dried, you can certainly buff it, yeah.
Okay, like it's not gonna fade out.
No, it won't fade
Because
out.
the issue I got right now is every time I try colors in my stuff, once I go to the buffer, it just fades,
Oh,
disappears. But maybe it's because I'm sending too fine too.
yeah, that could be, yes, that could be, and you're actually taking some of the pigment off. And yeah, you know right away, for example, if you start to buff something and you see that, you know, for example, this green color starts to appear on your buffing wheel,
Yeah.
you know you're taking the paint off. What some people will do is put a couple of coats of clear lacquer on top before they buff it,
Before you buff?
and so then you're really buffing the lacquer, not the pigments underneath. And that will also greatly intensify the colors, just putting a coating over top, whether it's lacquer. At the art stores, you can get a variety of different latex-based and other clear coats to go over artwork. Artists use them if they're using chalk crayons or charcoal or things like that, so that they don't smudge over time. It basically is just they call it a fixative, and it's just going to put all of that color and sort of stabilize it right on the surface.
It won't
Can
curdle your,
can you use like the spray lacquer?
Yes,
On
that's what I
acrylic?
use. I use just the rattle cans of Watco lacquer. I typically use semi-gloss,
Okay,
but you can use high gloss if that's the effect. I think there's a satin as well in that line. So yeah, whatever you like.
it doesn't curdle your paint.
Nope, not once the paint's dry. It'll go over it just fine. So over to the lathe. This is a little piece of sapelli that I've just put on, and I've put some dark blue on it. And so, because Diane asked about the radial lines.
Your life
Bars somewhere.
Tommy bars.
They're only fun if you leave them in the chuck when you turn the lathe on.
Oh, yeah.
You only do that once though.
Yeah, yeah, you know, like, and after you've dug it out of the ceiling tiles or your ribs.
How do
or
you
your
tie?
ribs. So, what I'm going to do is a technique for applying paints using the fact that we can spin the wood. And so I have in these little craft bottles pre-mixed up some, these are actually inks, acrylic inks. And sample, yeah, here's a sample. Get these at the dollar store in a packet of 3 for $1.25, something like that. They have a very fine tip, and so I've just got some of that craft paint in the, yeah, and actually the tips are very similar to CA glue, and so these are iridescent inks, which are a nice counterpoint. I've got a blue acrylic paint background on here so that they will show up. So I'm just going to turn the lathe on and I'm just going to start applying paints, and which means anyone in the splash zone is going to get painted along with the floor and the lathe and Lee Valley ceiling. And so I have this handy dandy splash zone catcher.
Wow, that's pretty friggin' neat.
So that's
Pretty clever. It's well used.
to avoid some unsightly runs. So, that's not even close to straight.
Meanwhile, back at the ranch.
Meanwhile, back at the Tommy Bar.
Calum, may I assume that you're not colorblind?
I am not, as far as I know.
25% of men are.
Yeah.
Women aren't.
It's inherited from your mother.
What was that percentage of men who are colorblind?
25.
That seems high.
Makes some interesting color combinations.
That's our excuse for looking at the right color.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know, but.
That's our excuse for the way we dress.
It tells me I'm colorblind.
Goes along with the selective hearing.
You can't say, whoa, that's.
That comes with marriage.
I was tested by the military. I said, I'm good.
So I just put some paper towel down in the bottom of this typically because that's where a lot of the paint's going to wind up.
What speed do you turn it at?
Not too slow. No, you're good. Maybe not that fast.
It goes down to 500, I think.
It changes slowly too.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to aim for about 1,000.
You can also reverse too if you want to do anything.
Yeah, that might be interesting to see where that goes. Yeah, so we're sitting at about 1,000. So you can play with several parameters when you're doing this. The thickness or runniness of the paint will change the effect. The speed that you're turning the piece at will change the effect. And the curvature on whatever you're doing will change the effect as well. So for example, if you want really nice, basically what we're going to do is we're going to put the paint right here close to the center, and the centrifugal force is going to cause the paint to literally fly out from there. Surface tension will keep it adhered to the wood until it gets to the edge, and then it will come off, which is why this is here, because it literally, you will paint a stripe, a beautiful multicolored iridescent metallic stripe across the floor, up the front of your smock, across the ceiling. It goes everywhere.
Your left nostril.
Yeah. And
Does the orientation, like the reverse or forward, make a difference in the?
that won't most of the time. And I say that because if you have the lathe running nice and fast, that paint's just going to fly out from the center. You will get very straight radial lines that are all coming out from the center. If it's running fairly slow, like 400 or 500 RPM, what happens is the paint is moving out from the center, but the wood is moving, and so you get curved lines on there. And so you can really play with some neat effects if you did curved lines in blue in one direction, then reverse the lathe and say you did yellow in the other direction, so you'd have, like, you'd wind up with a surface that looked like you'd done it with a spirograph, those old kids' toys that you play with the pens. And
You've
so,
done it with a not perpendicular surface? like an angled surface?
I have not. But if it's relatively smooth angled surface, the paint will run along the angle. If it's just on this, like if you tried this on a spindle, for example, it would just fly off from where you put it on.
Yeah, no, I just meant if it was slightly askew, you might have a different.
Yeah. And so that's what this is. There's a fair bit of curve to this rim, and so I'm not entirely sure what's going to happen with this one. With the flat piece, which you noticed, I had been practicing that the other night. It just went right to the edge, nice and straight. The physics would start to take over, and if you had a sort of gradually increasing curve, at a certain point, the centrifugal force is going to get strong enough to, it's going to overpower the surface tension, and so the paint is no longer going to stay on the wood, it's going to fly off. And where it flies off will depend on the speed of the lathe, the viscosity of the paint, and other parameters. So I'm just going to start applying some color. This is a nice sort of teal green metallic ink. Just get some down here, and we'll just start putting it on. Now,
Oh, my eyes.
now because the lathe is running, it looks like there's just some paint in the center there, but if we have a look, we can see that it has put radial lines all the way out to the outside, and we can see they're not exactly coming out from the center. If you sort of put a ruler on them, they're missing, and that's because of the rotation of the piece as the stuff is coming out.
It's looking more and more like high school.
Yes. And so what will tend to happen too, is, as I apply more and more paints on here, the next paint I put on will tend to leave this center area where the previous paint left. And so you'll get sort of lines overlapping lines. I'll just put this on here and we'll try some of this.
Oh, I see the line inside the box.
Yeah, and so we have a lovely teal colored line inside the box here. Let's add some yellow to that.
Interesting.
And the neat thing about doing some of these techniques is like, it's a surprise. Like every time you turn the lathe off, you get something, you finally get to see what you've been doing. Like a nice
Tequila sunrise.
Yeah. And you could, if you wanted, leave it to dry for a while and then go at it with some more. And you don't have to have these little narrow applicator bottles. I've seen people just doing it with a brush and just putting it on, and if you get a good wet, heavy brush and just put it on there, it will throw that paint off. So I'm just going to go back to some of the other colors that we put on, not necessarily in the same order. Go back to some more white. Finish up. So then we can just turn this off and see what we've got here.
Oh,
So overall it's a little dark, so I might add some more of the yellow and white. You can just sort of play around with it,
Twilight Zone.
get it the way you like. So you can see it's getting fairly intense, and we have got quite a bit of paint built up on the inside of this box here. So
Like something out of a hippie commune.
yeah, and so it's just like they say, psychedelic, man. And so you can decide, for example, when you're going to hollow this out, just exactly where you want to start hollowing. You know, if you want if you want to leave some of that colored collar, you could start in here and make a small ring bowl type thing. You could start right out here and have only the striped rim. It's entirely up to you where you begin the hollowing to get that hollowed out.
What if you wanted the same grey collar, if it was equal, like right now it's not equal? You know, the inner grey collar that's pretty much solid grey.
Yeah.
You can see how the lower right hand edge is a lot thicker than the upper left hand. Or
Yeah.
reverse.
So if I wanted to do that, I would probably take a brush, because that will let me.
Is there any way you can control that while it's spinning?
Mm-hmm.
There's curves on that wood, isn't it?
Thank you.
Just before Gary goes home all green, I'm going to turn the lathe right down. This is probably going to be too fast, yeah. Maybe not. We'll try. So I've got a fair bit of paint on the brush here. So you can get a fairly even border around it. And if I wanted that to be completely green, because it basically the paint has mixed the green and the bluish gray and other colors as it's going out there. But it is kind of an interesting effect just to put a colored collar on.
You almost make it look like a daisy.
Yeah, actually you could have a lot of fun just doing white rays and then a yellow center and call it your daisy bowl. Daisy.
And how long do you let your setup dry before you?
If I'm, I get to the point where, I really like that and that's what I want to keep, then I'll probably leave it overnight to dry completely before I put the lacquer or other finish on the top. Because the thing I've found is that once those paints fully dry and the media in them, the fluid part of the medium dries off, they can change in appearance quite a bit, sometimes quite dramatically. So I used on one piece that I brought in for show and tell about several years ago now, some of these acrylic inks, and I just put them on with a little pump sprayer, almost like a little perfume sprayer, and put them on fairly thick. They were kind of liquid, and I used blues and whites and greens and a whole bunch of metallic gold, and for some reason the metallic gold just disappeared. It just, I guess it was heavier than others, and it just settled down to the bottom, and the greens and blues came to the top. Well, I can live with green and blue. And so I just set it aside. The next morning when I came and looked at it, as everything had dried down, the gold had all appeared through the green and blue as stuff had dried down. And so it had this really neat mottled look with the gold just sort of randomly appearing in the piece. So the other thing that I wanted to touch on was another way to apply paints is, what's the time?
10 after 3.
Okay. Is just airbrushing. And there are typically two types of airbrushes. And I think Lee Valley still sells this one.
That little critter.
And so this,
Or just a critter.
this is designed to go on a standard mason jar. And so you would put your paint in the mason jar, screw it onto here with the appropriate seals and gaskets to go in there, and then put an air hose on here, and it is just a simple finger trigger pull. So the air flows up through the handle, and what happens is a very narrow jet of air passes over the top of this tube, and because of the Bernoulli effect, it creates a vacuum here, and it draws the paint up the tube. And so this is what's called a siphon-fed sprayer, or you can get airbrushes that are the same. The airbrushes look the same, but they're just little tiny jars in a smaller unit. So that's one type. The other type is what's referred to as gravity-fed, and this is an example of a gravity-fed airbrush. And so we have a little, there's a paint cup on the top here where the paint goes in, and the air comes in the bottom here, a trigger to control the airflow. And so air flows along the tube, and the paint is sort of dripping down into the flow of air, and it gets shot out the front by the air. Airbrushes, both types, also come in two types, single action or dual action. Single action works just like an aerosol rattle can. When you press down, you've got air and paint coming out at the same time. This is a dual action airbrush. And what that means is that you have separate control on the air and the paint. And so, I'm just going to hook up the air supply here. You can run these off a standard compressor. I just use this little air pump, which happens to be Spray brand of air pump. This was originally acquired to supply air to aquariums, and so it got used for that for a while, and then it got retired, and I gave it to my mother, who was a potter, and she used it to apply glaze to the pottery using this thing. So these things will actually throw a fairly heavy material. And so I just added on a little pressure regulator, because for an airbrush you want low pressure, typically maximum 30 psi. And so these little pumps are relatively cheap. You don't have to go out and buy a big compressor. If you already have a compressor, you can use that. Just remember to crank the pressure way down. And it's even helpful to add a second regulator onto a big compressor, so that you can have the compressor putting out 50 psi, and then use the second one to break it down, give you fine-tuned control on the pressure. This tends to vibrate as it's running, and so it wanders around. And so I built this little wooden platform for it, which, if I'm using it at the bench, it just sits in there, and I'll just clamp that onto the edge of the bench, so it's not going to go anywhere. But for today's purposes, it can just sit on the floor. And so I will pass this one around. This is just another one, different brand. You can have a look at it. This is how they typically come. Just the airbrush. It comes with a hose, a few tools for servicing them, and cleaning things out. And so basically, there's a long, thin needle running right through the body of the brush, and it's so this is a dual action brush, as I mentioned. So that means that if I want air, I push down on the trigger, and I will get air flowing. And then when I pull back on the trigger, it slides the needle back, opening the port under the paint cup here, and so the paint can then flow out. And so by moving the trigger backwards, I get paint. Pushing it down, I get air. So I'll just turn on our little pump here. Experience the full joy of. So it's not too loud compared to the other compressor, but as soon as I press down on the trigger, I'm getting air coming out, and then I pull back to get the paint. And so for airbrushing, you want quite fluid paints, and so Golden and other manufacturers sell a line of paint specifically for spraying, and so these are called high flow acrylics. So these guys are called fluid acrylics, and these are high flow. Don't confuse them as I did, because then you get to learn all about the inside of your airbrush um, and so these high flow ones, just like a typical aerosol can, have got a little ball bearing inside to help mix up the paint. And this is quite fluid. And so to use this, I'm just going to put a few drops of paint in the cup, don't need much. And then if you want to, so then just to, I can press down and get air. I've got no paint coming out at all. And I'll do this sort of go backwards. Hopefully you can see. So I push down, I've got air, I pull back, and I start to get paint coming out. So I can control the amount of paint that's coming out. The further back I pull, the more paint I get. And the further away from the surface I am, the wider pattern I'll get. If you get in very close, you can put a very fine line. Whatever you want to do, if you're fairways back, you can get a very wide area, fill in fairly quickly, a fair bit of color. Which is great if you want to just cover a whole area, things like that. Or you can just create specific patterns that you like. Again, if you want a random pattern, like we were doing with the saran wrap, you can either make or purchase stencils. These are just some stencils that I got on Amazon. They're actually marketed for cake decorating. So you can put a nice white icing on your cake, and then so they're just thin pieces of plastic that have been cut out, and you can simply just hold the stencil over the wood. You just put some nice random shapes. Tiger stripes or flames, whatever kind of thing you want it to do. If you want fairly crisp edges on your pattern, you put the stencil right on the surface. And if you hold it further up or just off the surface, you'll get much more blurry lines on the edges. So I'm just about out of paint here. So one thing I forgot to do first is set up my paint bucket. Just somewhere to get rid of the paint. So an advantage of using an airbrush is that it's very easy to clean and change over from one color to the other. Just use airbrush cleaner. You can go out and buy it, somewhat exorbitantly priced if you like, or you can make it. The easiest version to make is just about 20 drops of typical Windex fluid for cleaning windows in a liter of water. Yeah, about 20 drops of Windex in a liter of water. I'm just going to flush that out until all the color's on. And then I can pick another color. Again, I don't need to be wiping anything out. I can just put my other color right in the airbrush. And, build up with different patterns and colors. I'm just going to leave that for a second. Now a very
So many things plugged in here, you just gotta find the right plug.
You can shut up.
A very specific type of stencil is one that you can make yourself for a specific purpose. And so this is really neat stuff. This is called frisket film. And basically all it is like, it's like sticky saran wrap. And so it's basically, it's peel and stick plastic. Again, you get this at art supply stores like Desserts or I forget who the other one's called. And so if, for example, I wanted to put a leaf motif onto some pieces, I just went and found some clip art line drawings of typical leaves, and I can transfer these to my frisket film simply by putting that over there, and a pencil or a pen, I can simply just trace out the shape that I'm interested in, or you can just draw it freehand, whatever you might want. So,
It would be similar to the rolls of stuff you can buy if you want to frost a window, or
yes, it's quite similar.
to that.
It's a little clearer than that, but it's very similar.
Isn't it quite as
So
sticky?
what's the name of it again?
Frisket, F-R-I-S-K-E-T. You can also get it in a version called Frisket Fluid, which looks like correcting fluid that you use when you're typing. And you just paint it on and it dries, and then you can paint over it. Basically, it's like a paint-on masking tape. And then it dries. When you're done with it, you can just get the edge of it, just peel it off, which allows you to make very random shapes. One of the greater challenges working with Frisket is getting the peel and stick started. There we go.
This is what that is.
Peel the backing paper. Yeah, it's like the old MacTac. Yeah, exactly. I'm just going to stick that on there. And so I've got lots of this, and I'm just going to smooth that on, and just take my X-Acto knife. And I'm just going to, using my X-Acto knife, I'm just going to trace out the line that I drew on the surface. And if you cut slightly into the surface of the wood, it's not going to matter because it's going to be the very edge of the paint, and your cut line will be almost invisible. So, then once you've completed cutting out your shape, I'm just going to remove my leaf shape. So I've now basically got the whole thing covered in plastic except for the leaf shape that I took out. I'm not going to lose that. I'm just going to stick it on the back here. So you might want to do something like decorating the interior of a bowl, or the or even the rim or the outside of a bowl with different shapes. I'm just going to, and they can be random shapes. As I say, you can sort of cut out shapes that you're interested in. Ooh, that's why I was wearing gloves. Get my hair back.
Sounds like me in the morning.
Yeah.
Come on, you can do it.
Yes, I can. Yes, I can. Yes, I
Gotta
can.
get her going.
There we go. Little layer block. And so I can just start to put some paint on here. So I'm just going to put a little. Put some green colors in the center here, the leaf. But because it's fall, we don't want to do it entirely in green. Fall, let's go for some red.
So Calum, there's no interchangeable nozzles. The thinness of your line becomes coded for the distance of how close or how far away you have your.
Yes, you airbrushes come in different sizes of nozzles, so you'll get some very fine, like 0.3 millimeter nozzle for very fine detail work. Green out, and so and you'll get wider ones for broader areas. So the folks that are right into airbrushing are the car detailers that sort of do custom designs on cars, or apparently now even
Hockey masks.
hockey masks, welders masks have become another really popular one. Everyone likes to win.
Bikers helmets.
So this is just golden brown. Notice I'm getting right on the paint over everything. Over that over there. Golden brown. The other thing I'm going to do, because the leaf I stuck on the back isn't forgotten. Get rid of our golden brown. Nice intense red here. Got enough more paint on this bench, Teresa's going to have me in your sandwich on.
Other than that, we should pay you for covering over all the crud that's on it.
Yeah, we can come back and paint all the rest of them.
I'm gonna get seasick watching me.
3:30, Calum? 3:30?
Normally wear a smock, like you usually wear a
Which?
usually wear a smock.
No, I usually wear a really old shirt. And I had to sort of give myself a pep talk because my standard approach wearing that old shirt is just bang on there. And so, yeah, not wanting to do that today, yeah, I got to be careful with what I'm doing with the paint on the fingers. So, really nice bright yellow on here. many of these high flow acrylics are transparent in color, so that one color will show through the others. Certainly not a perfect job, but enough to show the effect. So then when I've done all that I want to do with this, turn off our pump again. As I was preparing for this, usually when I'm working in my shop, I just turn that on, just leave it on because I've got the radio on and other stuff. I thought what I need is a little box with a switch on it, with the pump plugged into it. Then when I peel off the frisket, wind up with a big sticky mess to deal with. One of the things on my to-bring list was a garbage bag. And so we have just basically custom created a stencil to create that leaf shape. But the piece I cut out, I also kept, and I've had that on the back, and I was just getting rid of the paint there. And so we get the opposite effect there. And so you can use stencils either to create a positive impression, or you can use the negative impression to the stencil to create a negative impression. And so your shape is like what's not painted.
Can you hold it up vertically to the camera? Yeah, from the other side.
On the other side, it's just.
Thank you.
Which is actually a segue into, so pyrography is basically pyrography, drawing with fire or heat. And so basically you need some kind of wood burning tool for that. At the cheap end are these little wood burning pens, they call them, look like a little soldering pen. And they work basically the same way. This is the deluxe model. They cost about $35. It comes with a whole bunch of different tips and a variable thermostat, which is really only of much use. You need to turn it down if you're going to be burning on leather or something like that. With wood, I tend to keep it fairly high. And it comes with a whole variety of different tips. With the box for it, right? There's a whole variety of different tips of different shapes, and you just unscrew them, screw a new one in, and so you're able to just simply by placing the tip on the wood, you can begin to create. This is just a little round bullnose round tip. You get different patterns. If you move slowly, you'll get different lines, so you can draw things. Some people will use pyrography just simply as a texturing tool to give the wood texture, and so you can just go along and create all of these little pockmark shapes. A great way to fill in background of a particular area. And so these smaller ones, these small pyrography pens are a little slow. They don't get as hot as a proper pyrography outfit. I'm just going to put that back. So a proper pyrography outfit or wood burner, this is such a unit. This one's called Flex Burner, made in Ontario. And again, it has a variable thermostat, and the tips are basically just an insulated tube with some nichrome wire in the top that's bent into a particular shape. And you'll remember that nichrome wire is one of the things that yogis frequently able to provide to us. It's able to withstand very high temperatures.
Lots of it here if anybody wants some.
Well, he has some here. And so you can actually get these tips with different shapes of wire on the end, bent into different shapes. Some pens actually have little screws in here, and you can actually just change the wire and custom make your own tips. This particular brand, the pens that come with it don't have that. They're just sort of, for each different type you have to buy a different tip, which includes the whole pen. But several years ago, Dave McLaughlin did a little workshop that Ted Monk hosted on how to make these tips using readily available parts. And so to get this one to work, I had to turn on the pyrography pen, well, before we started, to make sure it was like good and hot. And you know, I've done bowls with rims that were all textured with pyrography, and so you spend about an hour turning and 10.5 hours burning the rim. But these little units are much faster. This is the unit that used to belong to my father, and he was doing a lot of wildfowl carving. So he was using the pyrography tool for getting the definition in the feathers that he wanted to get. And so this you just turn on and just wait a few moments for it to heat up. You can always just stick your tongue on the end of it to see if it's hot.
Show us, Calum.
Yeah. Again, with any of these pyrography tools, you've got to be really careful what you're sitting on and what's around them. They do get very hot. So this one very quickly gets hot, and so we're able to see. And the more slowly I move the pen, the broader and blacker the line is going to be. And this is just like a very thin, almost like a blade-like tip on here, which will give me very fine lines. So as I said earlier, you can actually combine these techniques. And so, for example, on our leaf here, if we wanted to put in some veins on our leaf, we can just use the pyrography tool. Stem. We'll go a little slower on the stem to thicken that up. We can even do the same thing on the other one. Put the little broader end on it. Those are just examples of the kinds of things that you can do to play around with those. So pass those around, have a look. I'll turn that off and make it safe. So probably the last thing I'll cover today is the application of metal leaf. And so just space here. And so one of the things I've discovered is that basically the way you apply metal leaf, traditionally gold leaf or copper leaf would be made by taking little tiny nuggets of the actual pure metal, putting them between layers of leather, and then pounding them with a mallet repeatedly and for a great length of time, until that little nugget of metal has got spread out by the repetitive blows into a fine, fine sheet of gold that might be only a few atoms in thickness. Real gold leaf is extremely expensive. It's a very laborious and slow process to make, and really, it's hard to find the pure gold leaf, and very expensive when you do. Fortunately, there are a number of art suppliers that produce fake gold leaf. This is actually incredibly thin plastic that is, like in this case, it's gold, there's copper here. And so these are just the individual sheets of the leaf material in between pieces of paper. Right in. And so you get the copper leaf material in between the sheets of paper. And the way this is applied is with a particular type of glue, referred to as size. And it usually comes in a bottle or a can in this case. This one's called Old World Art, gold leaf adhesive size. And it's like thick milk, almost like condensed milk. And it goes on white, and then you leave it to dry, much like contact cement. And so you're just going to paint it on, leave it to dry, and then once it's dry, it is ready to apply the leaf. And so I've got another blank here that just before the meeting started, I painted a few patches of the size on here, and if I touch them, I can feel they're just ever so slightly tacky. And so put some gold leaf on here. This is really tricky to use because it's so thin, it gets moved around by just about anything. So you don't want to sneeze or even breathe hard when you're using this. And so I will just put this right on the size that I put on there. So put that on the first piece. Just put that there. In my bag of tricks, I've got a brush. And so then, with a soft brush, you're just going to go over it and just sort of tamp it down onto where you have the size. And it will only stick where the size is. And so then you can just use the brush and it just starts to tear away. Basically, you're just removing any of the gold leaf that's not on an area where the size is. If it's come off of some areas, you can just move some gold leaf on there. So this is basically how the rim of that platter was done. I just put the size on the rim, and then when it was ready, just went around with the gold leaf. And a rather interesting variety is this variety, which is a whole assortment of basically it's a whole bag full of little tiny fragments of gold leaf, copper leaf. There's also this version that looks like heat treated metal, so it's glued. And so this is basically a whole mixture of little fragments of all different colors, which can again give you a rather different effect. This is harder to get on because it won't go on like a sheet. And being a very thin plastic, it's very susceptible to static electricity. So we'll just get some of this out here. Just sort of start putting it on randomly.
Can you use a burnisher with that instead of a brush?
Yeah. In fact, often what I have done, and because I think this size has got a little, it's so dry here in Lee Valley, it's a little over dry. So yeah, you can burnish it. What I'll often do is just use a Kleenex and just sort of ball it up so it's not to use it to really press that in. And then you can just start to It will tell you on the instructions. You know, you get like 15-minute size, which means it'll be ready in 15 minutes. This is 60 minutes, so that's why I put it on at the beginning of the meeting. I think it could be ready, but you may have to play around with the timing, just depending on how dry the conditions are, where you're using it.
So is it just slightly tacky when you put the board
Yeah,
on?
if you feel it, it's just, yeah, ever so slightly tacky. And so just get rid of the excess. Like I say, it doesn't adhere anywhere that there isn't size. So you can see the sort of effects that we're getting there. And the other really neat thing you can do with size, since we have some on here, is you can get the interference pigments not as a made-up paint, but as a dry powder. And first saw this technique being used by Emma Cook, who's a turner, goes by the name of the Tiny Turner, because she's only about 4 feet tall, apparently. And so this is interference pigment. These are basically the little fragments of mica. And this is a mixture. This is red-blue interference. And so it's a mixture of both blue reflecting and red reflecting mica. And what Emma had been doing was turning bowls and then carving a band of texture around the rim, and then applying what she called rainbow colors to that band to get an interesting effect. And I realized when I was watching her do it, those rainbow colors that she's calling, those are just interference pigments. So I'm just going to apply these dry with a brush. And so you just, a little dab will do you, and you just start putting it on.
So that's on the sizing.
And so I'm going to do this, because it won't stick anywhere that the size isn't. And so just because I pre-painted some size on here. And get it all nicely covered up. Get rid of the excess. Where'd my patented burnisher go? Just wipe off the excess, and so you can actually wipe it off fairly aggressively, because it will only stick where the size is. And you'll see as you look at this when you move around, you'll see, depending on the angle, you'll see both a red or a blue reflectance on that. So, I think I made enough of a mess up here. Yeah.
Just like a regular seminar.
Yeah. So any questions? We'll probably wrap it up there and get to some of the other things we need to do.
Are you going to finish the green?
Oh yeah, we can do that.
Here,
It
Yogi,
won't
just
take
hold
long,
that
because
up.
I've got some paints mixed up here already. So I'm just going to put some interference paints on here with some saran wrap. Oh, actually, I'll show you just how creative you can get with applying these things. I'm just going to take one of my plastic droppers and just going to take that paint and I'll put just this is a technique that the crafters call balloon painting. I'm just going to use a balloon. All I want is a smooth latex surface, in this case a latex glove. I'm just going to take part of it and then just simply press the balloon on and pull it off. And what it does is it pushes the paint out in random ways out from where the drop was. Just that gets over. See if it was green on here. spot on my balloon. Just sort of randomly dabbing around.
Putting on a popcorn ceiling.
What's that?
Like putting on a popcorn ceiling.
Yeah. And so, doesn't look like much yet, but as we start to dry it, it will come on. And then, as I say, you can do things like just put on a drop or two of paint, and then no paint in the airbrush, just using it as a source of air. I'm sure there's no paint in the airbrush. Just clean off the dust. Just by picking different angles, you can chase the paint around.
If I gotta chase paint around, I'm not gonna do it.
Put it on the lathe, spin it around.
Yeah, exactly. I'm sure it's probably somebody who's doing this who thought, hang on, if I just put this on the lathe, it would all... You can use this to blow things around too.
On a galaxy far, far away.
Miniature course in leaf blowing.
You can see the color starting to come out the reds.
Yeah, it just, as it dries, as that medium dries off, it goes from white to clear, and then the color all shows through. So it may have seemed a little odd adding green onto a green background, but it does give me a metallic effect. So you'll be able to see some of the, as you move it around, when you look at it, you'll see some of the metallic on there from the green, and you'll see the red as well. And so you could simply just keep adding more and more, blotting it on, building it up in layers, use 3 or 4 colors. I think on that other platter there was 3 colors added on to the blue. And yeah, so those are a bit of a view into some of the things I've been doing to play around with enhancing turnings that might be rather boring otherwise. Just some decorative techniques of different styles. How's our little centrifugal guy doing? Should be nice and dry by now. Oh, one thing I will show you quickly, because this can be a little tricky. Allow us to go to the lathe. Should do some turning at the turning guild.
Novel idea.
So one of the things that can happen, and this is the voice of experience, is you've got this surface, this rim on this platter or something that you're really pleased with, you really like the way it turned out, and you go to start hollowing the interior, and as you put your gouge on here, you're ready to start, and the first thing, your angle's a little long and it skates out across the surface. It just destroys your painted surface. Because this is, by none, the best paint remover you will ever come across. So, what I do is create a little starting groove. You can use the point of a skew for this. My own weapon of choice is, or a corner of a parting tool.
Pyramid tool.
My my favorite weapon is Richard Rappin's spear point tool. It's a nice heavy-bodied scraper with a very fine point on it.
Never found a use for that. Now I know.
Oh, it's actually is a really effective scraper. So I'm just going to decide about where I want this, where I want the rim of the bowl to start. I'll leave a little of that green there, so I'm just going to put the point up against where I want it to start. And I'm just going to push in to create, all I'm doing is creating a little groove, creating a ledge, because that way when I then come with my gouge, I've got a surface to get the bevel up against, and it's going to prevent the gouge from skating out. And so that I can just put the tip of the gouge right in that little groove, and I can then begin to turn it away. Certainly don't need to turn that all out. That'll give a sense of how you can get started, and you get a sense of what that ball is going to start to look like. So you can leave that little green ring around the edge. Or if you decide, you may get it hollowed out and you decide, nah, I don't like that green ring after all, you can just start another groove just outside it and turn out a little wider part on the ball. So, just do this, put up the Tommy bars. Send this over so folks can see. Yeah, so that's actually nicely dried off. Get to see it up close. Okay, it's now 10:30, so I think we can probably wrap it up and get to some of the other parts of the meeting. Any other questions? Yeah.
You got, beside you have, so what were you going to do with that air grinder?
Oh, I was going to do some texturing and.
Well, I just wondering what you did with it.
Yeah, I'll pass it around so people can see it. It's remarkably effective. If you want to do texturing, as I said, you can do it with pyrography. You can get a whole series of little burrs to use in a Dremel tool of either carbide drill burrs, or these are diamond burrs. This is a little heavier duty. And so this is just a micro air die grinder. Micro because usually a die grinder that's air driven is a fairly big thing. And so this is again just sort of like a pen-like affair. It has a chuck in it just like a Dremel tool, comes with some wrenches, and these are just carbide burrs that I've got. So you can see what, just got those off an online retailer, Amazon I think. This does need a fair bit of air pressure, about 90 psi to run. But unlike your Dremel, which is going to run at about 10,000 RPM maximum, this runs at 54,000. So it's basically it's a trip to the dentist. Yeah, I brought this along because this is a platter. I was going to do some carved stuff on the rim with different colors. I sprayed it black and then realized that I really did not have a good surface on this. Either there's a couple of small cracks in it, and some tear out in various places that I hadn't noticed when I was getting it prepared. And so I'll pass it around and you can have a look at it just to see. So it's not the case that you can do a real quick and dirty job of your turning and sanding and then say, well, I'll cover that up with paint and no one will ever see it. The paint actually magnifies the surface because you're making everything the same color, with paint, and so any imperfections in the surface, especially if it's a satin or semi-gloss or gloss paint, it will just pop right out. Which is why the guys doing auto body work have those huge lights all along where they're working, so they can see any little blemish at all. But I'll just explain quickly. There's a pottery technique that is used called sgraffito, in which they'll use typically one-colored clay, often white porcelain or a darker earthenware, cover it with a contrasting colored glaze, and then before they fire it, they will scratch away the glaze to create patterns in the glaze. And so you may actually have done it in elementary school art class, where you'd like get some colored paper, totally cover it with black crayon, and then scrape away the black crayon to reveal a nice colored picture underneath. And so this die grinder, so it's something I could try with this.
We're at the dentist now.
Variable speed control, but sounds about right. But this does eat wood very quickly. Send that around. All right. That's a little quiet.
That'll fix it.
So the
You'll be fine for doing your fingernails.
Yes. Right
Oh,
down,
yeah,
right down to the
that'll,
first knuckle.
even those big ugly big toenails, it takes them right off. And so so you get a sense of just how deep that carves, really quickly with those. So I guess that's about it. So over to you, Gary.
Thank you very much, Calum.
Thanks, Calum. Very well done. Very well done.